Welcome, Christine, to our space. When we were thinking about where we wanted to go with the book club in the last session for this academic year, Malcolm was saying to me, who do you think we should invite? In terms of seminal works, who is it that we need to talk to at the end of an academic year? And we both picked Christine, but we said, we don't know whether we'll get her, but we can ask. Or, you don't get if you don't ask. And so we asked, and Dr. Callender said yes. And so we have been buzzing ever since. And so I think she needs no more introduction. Dr. Christine Callender, welcome.
Thank you, Camille. Okay, so hi everyone. Really please, Christine. I only use the title for formal academic kind of reasons. I don't use it for any other purpose. Sometimes I just use it to remind colleagues of who they're speaking to, actually. But hey, okay, so I thought I would start off really by just giving you a kind of potted history of my interest in Black teachers. And where do I start? I think it started when I was an NQT. I'm from South London. I ended up taking a job in East London, and I didn't do due diligence. At that time, I was just happy to get a job, and I'd got a job in the borough of Newham, and off I went, South London girl, into the depths of Canning Town in the mid to late 1980s. And if you can think about the ways in which our 3 Black footballers have been treated just in this last week, that was the kind of environment that I found myself in. I went to a school that was predominantly white working class. I could count the number of Black children on one hand, and there was only myself and another Asian teacher in the school at the time. These children were not used to people who looked like me. And if they saw people like me, it was at West Ham football ground and at the weekend, and they used to throw banana skins at them, and they used to make monkey noises at them. So as a young teacher, there I was in this school without the banana skins. I certainly did have the monkey noises, and I did have the goose stepping and the Zeke as I walked down the corridors. However, I was really fortunate in that I had a fantastic head teacher who, when I brought these issues to his attention, made it his business to ensure that those children, not that they were reprimanded, but that they were educated, right? And that it was the whole school's responsibility to educate those children and to not judge them based on things that they had seen the older generation do and which they thought were kind of normal. And as part of that, whilst I was working there, I was told that I was strict. And I was kind of thinking, really? Strict? Me? I have standards. Would I equate that with strictness? No, I didn't take any nonsense. If I set you a deadline for homework, I expected you to hand it in on that time, unless there was some other reason. And it started me thinking about what kind of teacher am I, and what is it that people see when I teach, because what I was getting back was not how I saw myself. And so I became interested in the whole area of Black teachers, and I went looking to see what I could read about it. And I found Beryl Gilroy's book, Black Teacher, and read that. I think I read it over 2 days, because once I started reading it, I couldn't stop. And if you haven't read it, and you can get your hands on it, in fact, I think it's just recently been reprinted, I would really recommend that you have a look at it, because there are, even though she wrote it in I think the 70s, there are still parallels now with some of the things that she wrote about in terms of our experiences in schools. Yes, I can send the info about the book, yeah. So I read that, but then I also started reading some of the American literature as well. And I looked at the work of Michelle Foster in particular, because she was writing about the experiences of Black women teachers in the South, and how their kind of practice was kind of located within their histories. It talked about purpose. It talked about prejudice. And for me, what I got from Michelle Foster's work was that there was something there about these teachers that meant that no matter what was thrown at them, they had the strength to continue. And I was thinking to myself then, you know, how does that relate to Bell Gilroy's generation? Because you know, at that time I knew some Black head teachers, and I started talking to them about, you know, what has it been like? What has it been like? And I suppose because I have an interest in sociolinguistics, I'm very, very interested in the connection between language and power and the whole social milieu within which we operate. When I read things, I read it through not just to get the information, but I'm looking at the language that's used, the power of that language, why it's been constructed in a particular way it has been. So I started kind of looking at things a bit more critically than I had in the past, and I decided I wanted to do a bit more work on it. So how could I kind of marry my ideas around being a Black teacher and what that meant in terms of my practice and my philosophy, but how did that also align with my interest in language, particularly around African retentions in our languages? So the kind of patterning that we find in the church, that we see in music, how, you know, were we using those patterns in our day-to-day teaching? And that is what I ended up doing for my doctorate. Because, you know, I wanted to find out what is it about these teachers that I am focusing on that enables them to ensure that children stay engaged with their learning, that all children achieve, that all children are enthused and motivated. And I looked at it through the lens of language. And at the time, my book was the only one that looked in terms of practice and pedagogy, and Audrey Osler's book looked at the experiences of Black teachers. And I think that they remain two of the only substantial non-policy related texts that are out there. Now, bear in mind, my book was published in 1997. But yet we have a whole range of discourses that are taking place about Black teachers, but no significant piece of research has been undertaken since. You might ask, why haven't I done it? Two reasons really. The first is that much of my life in teacher education, in higher education, has been in the area of teacher education. And when you are operating within that particular framework, it is very difficult to do anything in terms of your academic research, because you're literally, like yourselves as teachers, working to the school term, supporting NQTs and all the rest of that. So much of my life in the university sector has been in that area. However, for the past few years, it hasn't been. So I've now been afforded the time to kind of think and write and to start to put ideas, you know, not start to put my ideas, I've had the ideas, but actually to commit them to paper, and to start getting that whole volume of stuff that has been sitting there out into publication. The other thing is that, you know, when people like me apply for funding, we're very rarely successful. And that's an interesting thing for me as a Black academic. To see that there are funds out there, people do get money. I mean, I suppose the kind of things that they're interested in writing about when it comes to Black teachers aren't the things that I want to write about. But the funding issue is quite an interesting one. So most of my work, if not all of my work, has been unfunded, particularly the stuff around Black teachers. So that's a bit about how I came into this area of work. In terms of where I think we're at in relation to Black teachers' development and education, For me, the work kind of sits generally under three main areas, and I'll talk about each of these and what I think the features of them are and what I think they kind of add or don't add to the conversation. So I think one of the most popular ones is this whole discourse around recruitment and retention. And I describe this as a circular narrative. We have known for many, many years that the proportion of teachers who come from Black or Asian or other minority ethnic groups is small. We have known that there have been various recruitment efforts to increase numbers, whether that's by bringing in overseas trained teachers, whether that's by having funding for teacher education providers, which is around, recruitment issues and increasing numbers. We have had initiative after initiative after initiative after initiative, all around narratives which serve the conversation around we need more Black teachers. I often find myself asking why. And I ask why not because I don't think that there should be a workforce that's representative of the communities that are served, but I ask why because we constantly have a gaping hole. We cannot keep the teachers that are in the profession. So for me, one of the questions we need to ask is why have we got this leaky pipe? What is it that is causing those teachers to leave at all levels of the career trajectory? If we look at teacher training, BME teachers are more likely to withdraw. They are more likely to have to do more than the 1 year for various kinds of reasons. Often those reasons occur whilst they're on school placement and their placements are terminated, or they make a decision to step out to save their program basically, and it means they then have to do an additional term. Because of that, they then don't necessarily get into a full-time post. They end up having to do supply or short-term contracts, and starting off your career like that as an NQT, as you can imagine, is quite difficult to kind of establish yourself, and it takes longer for them to establish themselves. We know that there are issues post kind of NQT as well. We do have a good few teachers who leave after a short period of time of teaching, and I think we need to be asking some questions about why. But I tend to resist the recruitment and retention narrative. I think it's quite topical. It's the language of policy. It's a narrative that allows us not to really engage in a meaningful kind of way with conversations about the day-to-day experiences of Black teachers. So as I said, for me, recruitment and retention it's important, but it's kind of circular. I don't think it's moved our thinking on any further because we really just seem to be having the same conversation. One of the other areas I think where there's a lot of conversation is in the area of progression. So we also have lots and lots of discussion about we don't have enough Black head teachers. We don't have enough Black senior leaders. And to me, I don't see how you can kind of have this conversation without kind of addressing the previous issue around, numbers that kind of come in and the experiences that they have when they do come in. And we know that there's, a glass ceiling or a glass escalator, if you want to call it that. We know that for a lot of our teachers, getting into middle management isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, we have a significant, I would say, number of Black middle managers, but the transition from that middle management position to senior leadership and headship positions, that's where we seem to have the problems, and that's where the barriers exist, and that's where the systemic issues exist. Because for whatever reason, we're never quite ready enough. We've never quite got the requisite amount of experience. We've always kind of picked to the post, you know, always second. You know, you did a really good interview, but there was someone there who was just that bit stronger than you on the day. And I think we do, you know, for me, one of the things that we have to do is that we have to interrogate how selection panels work. Not just in the sense of, okay, do they follow the procedures? Of course they follow the procedures, but actually there's a way of thinking, of acting, whether knowingly or otherwise, where decisions about who gets to the shortlist and who is offered the post is kind of constructed out of groupthink, for want of a better way of explaining it. So I was looking at some research that came out of Ireland, for example, and they were looking at how selection panels kind of recruited in their own image and what the process for that was. And as I said earlier, my interest is in language, so I was quite interested in the conversations that these panels were having and the kinds of comments that were being made about candidates and the impact that those conversations and those comments had ultimately on the decision as to whether someone was deemed suitable to be appointed or not. And I'm really beginning to think now that, you know, one of the things we need to interrogate much more is this whole thing about selection panels. And perhaps now is a kind of interesting time for that, because certainly in my own institution now, we have a requirement where every selection panel must have a BME member on it. Well, even though the institute is a huge place and has hundreds of staff, there aren't that many that look like me. So I get asked to sit on a lot of interview panels. And I go, you know, I could say no, but I do go because I like to see how these panels are run. I like to see how the questions are constructed. And I like to trouble the notion of equal opportunities, because, you know, there is that standard equal opportunities question. And often, because I construct the equal opportunities question to make people expose themselves, their lack of knowledge or their knowledge, it has been a point where people have said, oh, actually, you know, that their response to that question wasn't very good. Now, I ask myself, if I wasn't in the room, would this be an issue? Are we operating on the basis that we all know what equal opportunities is about? Well, I don't think we do. You know, I don't think we do at all. And I think that my presence there kind of rattles the whole kind of setup, because they don't expect me to be there. I'm naturally kind of quiet anyway, so they expect me to be quiet. And I suppose I am quiet, but the questions I ask, it's always a killer question. You're going to sink or you're going to float. Often people sink. So I've used my position now as one of the few Black members of staff who sits on these panels, because I'm now considered senior staff as well, which is quite interesting, to actually challenge the processes, to ask questions. You know, when we have this statement here, you know, this is an essential criterion. What actually do we mean? How can somebody demonstrate this? What are the questions we need to ask? And are we just paying lip service to this? So I think for me, the whole panel thing is quite interesting, and is something that I haven't yet started to write about, but want to, but because of the nature of the work and its confidentiality and all of that, I have to think very carefully about how or whether or not it's possible to do that in terms of academic writing, or whether I just use it as something that I have conversations with inside of my organisation under the EDI brief. So the thing about progression, as I said, for me, yeah, we're not really being told anything new. We know that there are barriers. We know that there are challenges. We know that Black staff are very well qualified, very well experienced, often go for jobs that they are more than capable to do and still don't get them. So to me, again, we're just kind of going around in a circle with that kind of conversation. My work, on the other hand, I see it as kind of exposing some of these tensions in narratives around recruitment, retention, and progression, in that I focus on the day-to-day lived experience of these teachers. Not because I just want to write about misery, because I don't think my writing is about misery. I think my writing, I hope, tends to show how these teachers navigate very inhospitable terrain and maintain their professionalism, and do lead to success as well, however success is defined. But my work kind of, on the one hand, looks at Black teachers' experience through the lens of race and what it is like to be racialized as a teacher or as a trainee teacher, middle or senior leader in schools in England. But at the same time, I also use the lens of whiteness to kind of peel back or expose the ways in which race is understood and operationalized, and how whiteness retains its power structures within the context of ITE and in schools. And because of the second layer of work, part of what I do is kind of explaining to my colleagues what they do, often subconsciously, without realizing it. And as a Black woman, that is a really interesting place to be in. And often I feel quite vulnerable, because in a sense I am putting my head on a parapet, ready for it to get shot off. But at the same time, if I wasn't in there and having this conversation, it wouldn't happen. People like Vinnie Land has done work on, race in ITE, and there are a few others, who have done work on race in ITE. But it's a conversation that we need to continue to have, because unfortunately, a lot of those kind of negative tropes about Black students still exist. Certainly when I went to the Institute in 1999, there was I, the only Black member of staff on that PGCE at the time, and with not one Black or Asian student. And yet the Institute is located in Camden, one of the most ethnically diverse boroughs in London. So I did question, why is it that these students aren't coming forward? And at the time I was met with a particular narrative, which was about, they don't have the right A-level grades, or they don't go to the right type of university, or we've had some before and they didn't do very well, and all the rest of it. So my view is I always come at this with evidence. So one of the first things I did was that I interrogated the data. What is that data telling us about who's applying, who gets shortlisted, who gets offered a place after shortlist? When they're on the course, what is their trajectory like? What does success look like for these students? Are they completing in the 1 year? Are they having to do an extended period of time? Are they withdrawing? Whatever. And to be fair to the IRE, there wasn't any real evidence of discrimination at all, but it was obvious to me that students weren't applying to the IRE. So I was asking myself, well, why? And fortunately at the time, we had funding from what was then the TDA to run sessions for students who wanted to come into teaching, and they were funding BME, and they were funding men into primary, and in secondary they were funding STEM. And I was located in the primary sector, so I set up some workshops for people to come along if they were interested in teaching, to help them with their applications, etc. And it wasn't necessarily for people to come along to apply to the IRE, it was for people to come along to teaching per se, and it was flagged for BME and for men. And what was fascinating for me was that I had rooms full of potential teachers in front of me who for various reasons had been led to believe that the entry requirements for the IOE were so high that they would not stand a chance to get in. Some who were actively discouraged because at that time, I think you had 4 choices on your GTTR form, and basically they were being told, well, if you choose the IOE, you're wasting one of those 4 because it's so hard to get in there. They only take people with first class honours, which was a load of rubbish. We have never, ever only taken people with first class honours, actually. We take people the whole gamut. The only people we don't take is people with passes and thirds. Everyone else, you know, you put your application in, it's judged on the basis of that application. So I did some work with them where we looked at applications and we evaluated them, looked at strengths, looked at weaknesses, etc., got a sense of what a good statement looked like. And then I did some work with them about, well, okay, what would your narrative be? What are your strengths? What are your areas of weakness? How do we write about those? And I kind of, you know, encouraged them to draft their statements, and it was me and a small group of other staff that we gave people feedback. Now, some of those people did come on to apply to the IOE, and some didn't, you know, and that's fine. My view was, as long as they left there knowing that the Institute was not shutting the door on them, and that the only person shutting the door on them was themselves, and they should at least give it a try. I mean, we are a lot better than we were. I think we still recruit above national average, whatever that is. But that doesn't mean that attitudes haven't changed. I think that certainly in terms of our primary provision, we are a bit further ahead than many institutions, and that's because I'm there on their necks, basically, asking them very difficult questions and leading staff development with the team, basically getting them to kind of challenge their own assumptions and kind of, you know, look at your data. Don't tell me don't tell me 3 years on a row that you are doing very well at recruiting BME students, because I can see from your data that they're not getting the highest grades necessarily. They're somewhere in the middling. There is this tail of withdrawals and taking longer to complete. So I want you to explain to me why that's happening and what you're doing to make it stop. So critical race theory and whiteness allows me to interrogate those kinds of questions. And as you will know, CRT is not particularly popular with our government or over in the States. And I think when you've got something that is causing such unrest in political circles, I think you're onto something. And I will continue to use CRT. My university's not got any moratorium on it at all. You know, universities are for thinking, and CRT enables us to think. So I will continue to use that. I will continue to work with the narratives of teachers and finding ways of amplifying their voices, because I try in whatever I do in my work to make sure it's the teacher's voice that is heard as opposed to mine. So I tend to share my analyses with the teachers that I work with. So anything that you see that I've published, those teachers have read it and commented on it, and I've responded to their comments. So I try to ensure that whatever I produce is as authentic in terms of their voice as it possibly can be. So currently, I am continuing my work on Black male teachers. I do that because I do think Black men have a particular set of experiences in teaching that are similar to that of Black women, but also different to that of other men. And I think that is a narrative that needs to be heard, because we can't continue to say we need more Black men, we need more Black leaders, we need more, without actually interrogating what's happening to them. So that is an area of work that I will continue, as well as some work I've started doing around the concept of eldership. So looking at how those more experienced and or recently retired Black leaders support and mentor those coming behind them outside of those formal CPD opportunities like MPQH and all the rest of that stuff, because we do know that when our teachers go on these courses, it doesn't necessarily lead to leadership. You know, sometimes it means they've just done the course, but they don't get into the jobs that we know that they are more than capable of. So I'm looking at ideas around eldership as well. Now, I think I've talked for a long time, so I think I'm going to shut up. And if anyone's got any questions, just go for it.